Hello and welcome to Common Mistakes I See in Webcomics. Today we're going to be talking about color. So first, let's define a few terms. Number one is value. Value does all the work and color gets all the credit. The more towards white something goes, the lighter the value. And the more towards black something goes, the darker the value. Next we have saturation, where on one side we have gray, and gradually move towards a brighter version of a color. And then last but not least, we of course have hue, which is where we have yellow, orange, red, purple, blue, and green. So with these three elements, we now have to create a cohesive piece. And one of the most common problems I see is that a lot of young artists will choose a saturated color, such as the ones we see in the color wheel I just created. The problem becomes that all of those colors are competing with which one is the brightest, and they're often towards the same level of value. So we're going to talk about a few ways to come up with a cohesive color scheme that's not going to be too bright for the reader. One of the common things we come across as young artists is that we are not using a traditional medium. We are using digital, which means all the colors are available to us. For example, a bright turquoise can often be very difficult to find in paint, or a neon pink, and usually those colors tend to have a thinner consistency. However, with digital, they can be made just as easily as any other color. So if we go into our piece, we have our line art ready, and we're going to start adding color. We want to think of the comic as an overall piece, how everything is going to fit together and how everything is going to be cohesive. The first way doesn't require too much art knowledge in terms of saturation and hue and value and a lot more common things that are seen in painting. And that is we're going to select a color scheme based on what we believe local colors to be. And we're then going to manipulate that in order to create a cohesive color scheme. So first things first, we're going to pick our flesh tone or our skin color, which will be a desaturated kind of reddish orange. Go too far towards yellow, and the character will look like they have a liver disease. We can also pick medium skin tones and dark skin tones. Drexel, however, has paler skin. Next, we can select Drexel's hair. We're going to hang out between the red and the orange because he has red hair. And we're going to select that color. And then the fun thing about making a webcomic is you can decide if you're going to have the characters wear the same clothing all the time or if you're going to change their outfits, which can mean selecting more colors. But for the sake of this, let's go with a blue. And let's go with a fairly bright blue. That contrasts our orange a lot. Those two colors are competing. They're similar in value and they're similar in saturation. So we aren't sure if we want the orange to stand out more or the blue to stand out more. But that's a problem that we can certainly solve. So the next thing we're going to do is pick out a few more colors that go along with his accessories. So like the accents in his robe, we're going to go with this color. For his undershirt, I'm going to pick this color. Let's see. And then I have the ring in his goatee that I'm going to do a nice golden color for. So the next thing we have now picked out our local colors, and they aren't very cohesive. They're kind of all over the place. We're then going to select what kind of overall feeling do we want our comic to have. When I originally created Fortune's Fancy, I had a medium brown grayish overlay that lean towards sort of a sepia. And for this, we're going to use a warm tone. We're going to select the color of his hair. And in here, I've selected Turnip Pin in Clip Studio, and I've taken the opacity down to 17%. It's a little lower than I need it, so we'll raise it up to 26. And we'll go over these colors right here about 2 times. And this blue still reads as blue, even though it's more of a purple. I can move it slightly more towards blue. If I want a little bit more contrast. This green has gone from a nice mint color all the way over. And I can swing it slightly back to yellow or green to make it a little bit cooler, and I can also make it a little bit lighter. The issue that I don't want to recreate is bringing it too far back into the green so that it no longer fits into these colors. Now my light blue has moved towards this grayish tone with a warmish undertone, and I'm going to bring it up in value so that it's lighter. And then this has become much more orange, so I'm just going to move it up in value just a little bit. Again, not messing too much with saturation. So let's see. Let's take this and fill in the piece and see how it works together. One of the issues I have with creating color schemes is I sit down, and when the colors sit by themselves, they look fine. But as soon as I start applying them to the piece, something seems off. One of the things you can do to help with that feeling is to start with a gray background that gives you a more neutral color to look at rather than white. Whereas white is very stark, very bright, and you're likely to pick colors either too bright or too dark, simply based on having a white background. Also, having a white background would imply that the character is standing in very, very bright sunlight, which means they're going to be very desaturated and very bright, towards white in almost all of their values. There are a few things that I pick colors with because I feel pretty confident in my color selection, and that's going to be like the shadow where his mouth is, or like the color of his eyes. So this is the color we selected for his ring. This is the color we selected for his robes. This is the color for his accents. And then the color for his undershirt. So we've now selected a set of colors, and they seem to work fairly well. My one critique would be our purple is still competing with the orange a little bit. And my solution to that is either going to be to bring the value down so that it's a darker color. Now it no longer competes with the hair. The other option would be to bring it up slightly in value, still keeping it pretty desaturated. Another thing to consider when creating a character is also the background that they will live in. So for general color picking and selecting your starting colors, a gray background gives a great starting point, but also consider, for example, the background here is a bit lighter, so perhaps the darker robe would fit better. Now, the next option in selecting colors is going to be, rather than starting with colors, we're going to start with value. And one of the ways we can see value without turning something into grayscale is by adding a layer, filling it in completely black, and then selecting the type of layer to saturation. This will create a layer that puts everything into grayscale. So we're now able to look at something based on value and not worry about saturation and not worry about hue. So with Drexel, we can see that his skin contrasts his hair, his goatee, the ring in his goatee, and it contrasts his robe. The accents on his robe are quite a big value difference from his actual robe. And perhaps you want the values to be a little closer, you want a little less contrast. Then we can select this color and decide if we want that value to be lighter or darker. Of course, we can turn off the saturation layer. And we have decided this color is a little too light. So I'm going to bring it down. I'm going to pull it a hair towards more saturated. And I'm going to try that out. That decreases the value difference between the robe and the accents on the robe. Another way to select colors is going to be to create your own color palette or to draw inspiration for something else. There's a few ways that people decide on what color palette they're going to use. They may choose an analogous color palette, where if I decided this is what Drexel's skin tone is, this is what his hair is, those are both orange tones, so I can keep everything else being in the red or orange range. So there's a pink. So rather than picking this purple, I can move that up to red. And now he can have a red robe. And then that can be the accent. The ring in his goatee can lean a little bit more towards yellow. And notice that even though I'm picking analogous colors, even though the hues are next to each other, I'm still staying somewhat desaturated in order to create a cohesive color palette. Another thing we can do is a complementary color palette, where if I say his skin is this color, his hair is this color, the opposite is going to be hanging out in blues. And I'm going to select those. Once again, trying to avoid going into a whole lot of saturation. Generally, the trick to being able to do a complementary color palette, for example, if you do red and green, orange and blue, purple and yellow, that those colors are desaturated and one side of the color will tends to be dominant. So if I decided that I wanted to do a complementary color scheme, I could pick this blue. I want to desaturate it a little more. And that becomes his robe color. With this one, I think I'll also go with the blue. I'll go a little lighter and still stay desaturated. And that leaves his undershirt, which we can do as a very light blue. And now he's very predominantly blue, with his flesh tone and his hair being orange, which is a warmer color. One thing to watch out for is that if you're using blue throughout, I repeat the blue again by putting it in his eyes. So I'm not entirely making section by section where this half is blue and this half is orange. It's going to create a different division. In addition, if I wanted to continue with this color scheme, down here, the charm he wears in his goatee, I could also make that a shade of blue to repeat the blue throughout the piece. So we've talked about a few ways to make a color scheme. One is to select colors and then use opacity in order to blend those colors closer to another predominant color. Another is to start with values and then add color based on those values, remembering to stay in the desaturated to mid-saturated zone. And then, of course, there is selecting color palettes and color schemes based on analogous colors or complementary colors. And with those, we still want to remain in the more desaturated side in order to not give too much strain to the viewer's eye. Hey, hi. Support me on Patreon, where I create art tutorials and do art critiques. And you can read my webcomic, Fortune's Fancy, available on Webtoons, Comic Fury, Tapas, and fortunesfancy.com. For anything else, check out my link tree. Thanks. Bye.